In our next journey into JavaScript, we're going to take a look at events. Now, we're only going to concern ourselves with a specific event right now, and that event is going to be our click event. Now, we're able to register events and apply events and do things with events in a variety of different manners, and events can be attached to just about any object in JavaScript, and in this case I'm going to be attaching events onto a button. Now when we do that, we're not limited to putting events on buttons only, but those are a logical clickable item, so that's why we can attach to it. It also, when we use a button, it simplifies setting things up quickly because it has a look and appearance. So if I look at it here, they look like buttons. They're clickable. They show that interaction where we get a hover state where they change their visual representation. So they work really well for that. But normal text, a picture, any HTML element that we put on our page, we can attach a button, attach a clickable event to that. So how do we do that, you may ask? Well, the first thing, of course, is we want to gain access to our elements. So we'll use our query selector. In this case, I only have one paragraph, so I'm just grabbing the P. I did put an ID on it, but I'm getting it by its paragraph element. Otherwise, we could put the hashtag in there. In this case, both will work. I'll put the hashtag because perhaps I'll have a second paragraph later. We shall see. Now, as we're putting in the next ones, we'll have hashtag B1. And then B2 will be, well, no wonder it's not completing. Document, query selector, hashtag B2. So now we have access to our three elements on screen. We can do something with it. And in this case, I'm going to work on our style once more. And we'll just have two styles. And we will do display block. And then I will have display none. And while we're doing this, again, we can have, going back to when we worked with classes, we can change colors, change font stuff, change any of that. But for simplicity's sake, we're just going to change working with the display property, so we will either see it or we won't when we click on the button. Now, back a long time ago, what we would have done is we would have said b1.onClick is equal to. So a long time ago, we would use onClick equals function, and then so we're setting the onClick event, we're equating it to a function, and then we'll tell the class name for, oh, that's right, it's not P, it's P1. The class name will be equal to display none. So now if I save that, go over here, and P1 is not defined. Oh, it's not P1, it's just P. My bad. I'm still remembering from the previous tutorial where we used P1. So let's save it. No error in the console. And now we can see it went away. Now I don't have any way to bring it back yet, but if I look under elements, we can see it's still there, but its class has been set to display none. So we can see right now, I refresh the page, the paragraph has no class on it. I click the button, we will see how that changes, and that class has now been applied through JavaScript. So we're not going to use onClick as a way of doing it. Instead, we're going to use a more modern method, which is going to be AddEventListener, and then the event we are listening for is click. Now the nice part is we have all kinds of different events that we can work with, and we'll talk about that shortly. And we could do an anonymous function here, but instead I'm going to do a named function. So b2.click handler, and then we type in the word false here. So false is one of the options that goes when we're using event listeners. So onClick doesn't really give us a lot of parameters or other options in dealing with this event. We can't prevent the default action that's happening during this event. What I want to do is to now define this function, and I define a function using the function keyword. I have all kinds of bad typing going on right there. There's no period, so that's just the name of my function. b2click handler is my name, and now when I define a function, I put in some parentheses, then I do curly braces. So a variable, think of a variable as an object. It's a reference to an object or a thing inside our program. A function is an action or a verb. So variables are nouns, functions are verbs. Functions are things that do something. So in this case, I want this function to do something, and I will then use paragraph dot class name, and then this will be equal to display block. So that will allow us to bring it back. So you may be looking and going, okay, well this was just one, thing. That's how we did. That was much easier to work with it. And the answer is yes, but, and this is the big but, we can register events with an object. So the object listens for that event to happen, and then we define out what that event is. So we're separating the registration of the event from the actual definition of what action we want to have happen while we do that. That allows us to make our code ultimately easier to read, and this option over here gives us greater flexibility as we work. And in the description, I am going to be putting a link to AddEventListener on MDN that goes into this in much greater detail, talking about what those options are, what they mean, and how it works with it. And another thing that's good about using event listeners is there are times when we need to remove an event listener, and we can't do that very readily when we've just simply used onClick. So we can't at some point say, oh, I want to stop doing that. Once we assign it, it's there. But with the AddEventListener, we can also remove an event listener. So as programs grow more complex, there are times where we need to remove our listeners, and when we have used AddEventListener, we have that option. If we assign it directly like this, we do not. So that's another thing to work on with that. So now if I click here, so we can see these two buttons are controlling the visibility of this object, even though that object does show up in my markup. When we set its display property, it's no longer being displayed. So it's there, but we're not seeing it. It also effectively removes it from the document flow, so it doesn't take up any space on the page. So again, a different option would be if we use visibility and we have two options with it, visibility, and we can set visibility to hidden. Well, I'm going to choose hidden here. So now the difference when we are looking at this, so I save that, is if I click, we can see the buttons didn't go up, it didn't collapse on it. And now that brings it back and we can see visible. Actually, we're just going to set these up as, and then I can toggle between them so we'll be able to see it a little bit easier. So we have visibility and display. So display has display block, display none, display visibility visible, visibility hidden. And I'm going to do one other thing here. And we're going to set a wildcard rule. So this will apply to everything. And I will set the border, and I will go 1 pixel dotted red. So it puts 1 pixel red border around everything. So if we look at the page, we can see we now have those lines occurring around it. So now if I click here, we can see how it disappeared because we're using the second one will take place, which is display none. And we can just comment these out so we know we're just using the display options. So click, it goes away, click, it comes back. Even though we can see the markup, it's changing the class, so it's still in the HTML, it's just not shown on screen. But if I switch options, this time you'll see we didn't collapse, we didn't lose that space happening there, and now it comes back. So there are times and occasions where you may wish to use visibility instead of display as a way to show and hide things on your screen. Ultimately, it's going to be up to you as to how you want to go about doing that. We could also, as a way of hiding something, you can set its width, or its height to 0, or its width, depending on how you want it to collapse, which if you're doing that using either opacity or using size, so height or width, those are animatable properties, which are kind of nice because CSS transitions allow you to animate properties showing or coming and going, which can add a lot of visual appeal to your finished pages. So there are some other considerations to be made. Most of what we're going to be working with will be using display block and display none, just because we want that whole thing to disappear from the document flow, so it's as if it never existed. We can see it in the markup, but it's not shown to the end user. And again, the link to this page will be put in the description below, so if you want to read up on it in more detail and see how it works. And you can also then look up display and compare the two in the documents.